Before we begin, just take a second. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it late where you are? Is there a small lamp on somewhere in the room? Maybe a window slightly open? Maybe not. If you enjoy wandering slowly through strange corners of history like this, you can gently like the video or subscribe, only if you feel like coming back again. No pressure, truly. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always like imagining the quiet map of night stretching across the world. All right, let's dim everything down a little. Let's imagine a king. Not a dramatic king, not a shouting one, just a tired one. Because kings, it turns out, did not sleep very well. You might assume medieval royalty slept like babies. Huge beds, heavy curtains, stone castles, silence. But stone holds cold, cold holds damp, damp holds pain, and pain does not sleep. Imagine a king returning from campaign, his shoulder still remembering an arrow, his ribs still remembering the weight of armor, his jaw remembering a blow that landed months ago. He lies down. The mattress is stuffed with straw. The room smells faintly of tallow candles and wool. Outside, someone coughs. A guard shifts. A dog scratches at a door. He closes his eyes. Nothing happens. So someone brings him something? Just something small. Just a cup. At first, it is temporary. A battlefield solution. Crusaders learned quickly that when you cut into flesh to remove an arrowhead, the patient prefers not to scream the entire time. So, physicians carried poppy resin, thick, bitter, powerful. It was not recreational. It was practical. A solution. An improvised mercy. And when the king came home from war, he brought that solution with him, just in case. Just for pain. Just until the shoulder stopped aching. It never really stopped aching. And so the cup returned the next night. And the next. The king began to sleep. Not deeply. Not peacefully. But heavily. The kind of sleep that presses down like velvet curtains. And something interesting happens when a temporary solution works. It becomes tradition. The royal apothecary begins preparing the evening draught before sunset. Honey mixed with opium, a touch of wine, sometimes crushed herbs for flavor, mandrake if the pain is sharp. Servants start referring to it as His Majesty's Rest. It is no longer medicine. It is ritual, and rituals are difficult to remove. Now imagine this king receiving envoys the next morning, slightly softened around the edges, a little slower to anger, a little slower to decide, not incompetent, just padded. History does not record the softness, it records victories, losses, decrees. It does not record the velvet sleep. But the sleep mattered, because when the king cannot function without the cup becomes part of governance. Meetings are delayed until after he wakes. Documents are presented before the evening draft. Ministers learn the rhythm of sedation. An improvised battlefield solution quietly reorganizes the kingdom's daily schedule. No one intended that. And yet, this is how many things become permanent. Now let's linger here. because pain was not rare in medieval royalty. It was constant. Armor compresses the spine. Horses ruin hips. Infections chew through gums. Teeth rot. Gout blossoms like a private fire in the joints. And what do you do when you are the most powerful man in the kingdom, and your foot feels like it is filled with burning glass? You drink something. The church frowned upon excess, but the church also ran hospitals, and monasteries grew poppies. There's a quiet irony in that. Monks copying scripture by candlelight, and also refining sedatives in the herb garden. Not rebellion, not scandal, just practicality. The king needs sleep. The kingdom needs a king who can stand upright. Temporary, always temporary, until it isn't. And sometimes the cup is not enough. So the physician adds henbane. Henbane is a dangerous plant. Too little does nothing. Too much opens doors that should remain closed. But dosage is an art, or at least it was supposed to be. Now imagine the king slightly drifting during council. Not fully absent, just slower. Words arriving as if from down a long hallway. A war declared. A treaty signed. A marriage arranged. All under the soft weight of medicinal mercy. And no one questions it. Because what is the alternative? Pain makes rulers unpredictable. Sedation makes them manageable. There's a certain efficiency in that. Strange, isn't it? A solution invented to silence battlefield screams becomes a quiet administrative tool, and the king keeps sleeping. Not because he loves being high, but because he loves not hurting. That's the beginning. And beginnings tend to repeat, because somewhere else, in another court, another ruler is also not sleeping. There was another king. He did not return from war with an arrow in his shoulder. He returned from his own mind. Sometimes that is worse. At first, it was just stress. Too many petitions. Too many cousins. Too many whispers in corridors that never quite stopped whispering. Medieval castles are never silent. Stone echoes everything. Footsteps, servants gossiping, armor clinking, firewood cracking, even at night. And when a king begins to hear more than what is there, the noise becomes unbearable. So again, someone brings a cup. Not for pain this time, for quiet. Just a temporary quiet. A mixture of wine and something stronger. Poppy syrup. A little crushed henbane. Perhaps mandrake shaved thin and dissolved carefully. The physician calls it a calming draught. The monk calls it mercy. The king calls it relief. And at first, it works beautifully. The racing thoughts slow down. The suspicion softens. The faces of courtiers stop shifting in strange ways. Temporary. Always temporary. But the mind does not like returning to chaos once it has tasted calm. And so the cup returns. Then the dosage increases. Just slightly. No one announces it. No one says, "We are now sedating the king nightly." It just happens. Quietly, the apothecary begins preparing two versions. One mild, one stronger. 4 difficult days. Difficult days become common. Now imagine governance under this condition. Council meetings are shortened. Decisions are postponed. The king appears less frequently in public. At first, Ministers blame illness. Then they adapt. If His Majesty must rest longer, someone else signs the decree. If His Majesty is unavailable, someone else interprets his will. And here is where something subtle happens. A temporary solution to soothe a troubled mind becomes the foundation of administrative delegation. Power shifts, not dramatically, not with rebellion, but with scheduling. When the king sleeps until noon under sedation, someone must act in the morning. That someone gains influence. No one planned it. But narcotics quietly reshape hierarchy, and there is something almost gentle about it, because the king himself might not notice. He feels calmer, he feels safer, he may even feel grateful. Meanwhile, outside the chamber, the machinery of state begins learning how to function without him fully present, and sometimes the sedatives are not only for sleep, sometimes they are given before public ceremonies, before receiving ambassadors, before moments when the king must appear stable. The irony is soft but sharp. A ruler is chemically adjusted in order to project strength, temporary solution, permanent reliance. And occasionally, things go wrong. Too much henbane, too strong a syrup. The king speaks strangely, laughs at the wrong moment, freezes mid-sentence. Courtiers pretend not to notice. Medieval courts were very good at pretending. There is an art to collective denial, especially when the alternative is instability. Now imagine a day when the king refuses the cup, because sometimes they did, and the noise returns, the paranoia, the agitation, the sleepless pacing. Suddenly the ministers understand something clearly. The cup is not optional anymore. It is infrastructure. Without it, the kingdom trembles. So they ensure it is always available, always fresh, always ready. And what began as compassion becomes maintenance. You see how easily it happens? No dramatic descent into decadence, no wild revelry, just small adjustments, one night at a time. And the strange thing is, history will later remember this king as unstable, or mad, or erratic. It will not remember the quiet cup placed gently on a bedside table each evening. It will not remember the apothecary carefully measuring grains of powder by candlelight. It will not remember the servants instructed never to mention the draught aloud. And yet those details may have mattered more than the battles, because sometimes empires are not undone by swords. They are softened by sleep, and this pattern, this soft chemical cushioning of power, it repeats in France, in England, in Sicily, in courts where Arabic physicians introduce new compounds, in castles where monks cultivate herbs behind cloister walls, always practical, always temporary, until it becomes part of the throne itself. And somewhere, far to the south, in a palace filled with sunlight instead of damp stone, another ruler discovers a different kind of elevation, not for sleep, not for madness, but for curiosity. Now, leave the damp castles for a moment. Let the stone grow warm. Imagine a palace that does not smell like wet wool and smoke, but like citrus peel, rosewater, and sun-warmed marble. The air is different here, not heavy with fog, but with heat. And heat changes the body. It slows things. it stretches the afternoon. In some courts of the Mediterranean and the Eastern world, intoxication did not always arrive in a bitter medicinal cup before sleep. Sometimes it arrived after lunch, not because of pain, not because of madness, but because of curiosity and boredom. There is a certain stillness that comes with ruling a vast empire. After conquest, after expansion, there is administration. Administration is not glamorous. It involves listening to tax disputes, land boundaries, trade complaints, grain shortages. It involves sitting, a lot of sitting. And so, again, a small solution appears. Not dramatic, not scandalous, just a sweet confection. Perhaps ground cannabis folded into honey. Perhaps a paste mixed into sherbet. Served discreetly. At first, it is a novelty. Imported through trade routes. Learned from physicians. Shared in private chambers. Just something to try. Just to see. Temporary. Always temporary. But what happens when the afternoon becomes softer? When the sunlight feels thicker, almost tangible? When music seems to carry more layers than before? Rulers, like anyone else, notice these things. And when something makes long hours more tolerable, it tends to stay. Soon, the confection is no longer unusual. It is expected, served after meals, sometimes before poetry recitations, sometimes before private philosophical discussions. Not chaos, not debauchery, just elevation. And elevation can feel productive. Ideas seem larger. Time feels flexible. Conversations stretch into intricate spirals. A sultan may begin speaking about architecture and suddenly imagine domes that seem impossible under sober geometry. Is it the cannabis? Is it genius? History rarely separates the two. But again, something subtle shifts. If the ruler prefers afternoons softened by sweetness, then official audiences are scheduled in the morning. Military briefings happen earlier. Sensitive negotiations avoid certain hours. Governance adjusts, not announced, not recorded as policy, but practiced. A temporary indulgence reorganizes daily rhythm. And rhythm, once established, becomes tradition. Soon it is no longer the sultan enjoys this occasionally. It becomes part of palace etiquette. Guests may be offered confections. Musicians understand the mood. Poets adjust tempo. Even the guards recognize when the ruler prefers quiet corridors. And here is the quiet irony. In regions where religious law discouraged intoxication, medicinal interpretation made space for it. Everything can be justified as treatment for digestion, for stress, for melancholy. And so again, a solution is wrapped in practicality. It is never framed as excess. It is framed as balance. But balance can drift. Dosage increases slightly. Tolerance builds quietly. What once lifted gently now barely moves the mood. So the mixture strengthens, and the afternoons grow longer. There are anecdotes of rulers retreating into private gardens, discussing astronomy while sweet smoke curled into orange blossoms. Not collapsing, not incoherent, just suspended. And while suspended, decisions wait. Delegation grows. Viziers gain subtle authority, because someone must sign the order while the ruler contemplates the pattern of tiled mosaics. No conspiracy, no coup, just adaptation, and perhaps the strangest part. These rulers were often remembered as visionary, patrons of art, builders of impossible architecture. Were their softened afternoons partly responsible for creative ambition? We don't know. But we do know that cannabis traveled along trade routes as steadily as silk and spice. And where trade goes, habit follows. Temporary luxury, permanent court culture. And once a palace ritualizes intoxication, it rarely removes it, even when successors attempt reform, because servants remember recipes, apothecaries preserve measurements, and somewhere in the palace kitchen, honey is still being warmed gently over coals. Now notice how similar this is to the king with the sleepless shoulder. Different climate, different motive, same pattern. A small adjustment, a gentle relief, a permanent shift, and it spreads across courts, across centuries, across religions. North again, in colder lands, intoxication looks less like sweetness and more like survival, because when winter lasts half the year, elevation becomes insulation. Now imagine winter, not decorative winter, not a light dusting of snow on castle towers. Real winter, the kind that crawls through stone walls and settles into bone. In the northern courts, cold was not seasonal inconvenience. It was infrastructure. Floors were stone, walls were stone, chimneys smoked badly, windows were narrow slits stuffed with cloth, and bodies reacted. Joints stiffened, fingers cracked, breath came out in pale clouds. So someone poured something dark into a cup. At first, this had nothing to do with pleasure. It was practical. Alcohol lowers the sensation of cold. It creates the illusion of warmth. The blood moves faster toward the skin. The cheeks flush. You feel alive again. Temporary, always temporary, because the body is not actually warmer. It is simply distracted. But distraction works. And when a king must sit for hours hearing disputes about land borders while frost creeps along the windows, distraction becomes useful. So the cup appears at mid-morning, not as indulgence, as insulation. Ale fortified with herbs, mead thick and strong. Sometimes spiced wine imported from warmer lands. And here is where something subtle happens. When a ruler drinks to stay warm, the court drinks too. It would be impolite not to. Suddenly, meetings take place around large communal tables instead of cold stone chambers. More firewood is ordered, more barrels stored. Alcohol becomes logistical necessity. It becomes part of supply chains. Harvest calculations include not just grain for bread, but grain for brewing. A temporary solution for cold reshapes agricultural priorities. Isn't that quiet? Isn't that strange? Now imagine this continuing, not just through winter, but habitually, because warmth feels good, even when it's not freezing. And once the body associates governance with a steady hum of intoxication, sobriety feels sharp, too clear. In some northern courts, rulers were rarely entirely sober, not collapsing drunk, just slightly elevated, enough to soften edges, enough to dull the constant discomfort of damp stone and draughty halls. And when a ruler drinks regularly, so do the knights, so do the advisors, so do the guards. It becomes culture, not declared, not celebrated, just assumed. Breakfast ale, midday ale, evening ale, and sometimes stronger mixtures infused with herbs that blur more than just cold. Henbane again, poppy again, small additions to intensify effect, because tolerance is patient. It builds slowly and then demands more. Now, think about decision-making under this climate. Slow reactions, emotional swings amplified, aggression softened or sharpened. Some kings became famously volatile after drinking. Others became unusually affectionate. History records temper. It rarely records blood alcohol content. And there's something almost darkly humorous about it. Entire treaties negotiated by men who were simply trying not to shiver. Wars launched after winter feasts, where spiced mead flowed freely. No grand vice, just chronic insulation, and the infrastructure around it deepens. Royal cellars expand, special brewers hired, monasteries granted land to produce ale for the court. The church again involved, condemning excess from the pulpit, producing it in the cellar. It's a delicate balance, and balance is easier when everyone shares the illusion of warmth. But here's the problem. Alcohol dulls not just cold, but clarity. And when clarity fades, advisors grow bold. If the king prefers to linger by the fire with a heavy cup in hand, someone else reviews the documents. Someone else drafts the decrees. The temporary solution to winter discomfort quietly empowers bureaucracy. Again, again, the pattern repeats. Different substance, different reason, same outcome. And winter makes everything slower. Snow blocks roads. Messengers are delayed. Armies stall. So intoxication fills time. Long nights around hearths. Stories exaggerated. Rumors amplified. A drunken word spoken too loudly becomes court gossip by morning. And in the north, gossip can freeze into permanent suspicion. Some rulers drank not only for warmth, but for silence. Silence inside the mind. Silence from memory. Because long winters leave too much space for reflection. And reflection can hurt more than cold. So the cup stays close. And once a generation grows up watching a king rule with steady intoxication, it becomes the image of leadership. Strong voice, red cheeks, heavy laughter. It looks normal until someone tries to remove it. And reform always looks suspicious, because what is leadership without the cup? Cold, sharp, unfamiliar, and people do not trust unfamiliar rulers. Not in winter. Now notice how similar this feels to the warm palace afternoons. Different climate, different flavour, same loop, temporary relief, permanent structure, and somewhere, in another court entirely, intoxication is not about warmth or sleep. It is about experimentation, because some rulers were not just tired. They were curious, dangerously curious. Some rulers wanted comfort, some wanted quiet, but a few wanted answers, and answers can be more dangerous than pain. Imagine an emperor surrounded by scholars, not warriors, not priests, scholars, translators working from Arabic manuscripts, physicians debating humors, astrologers arguing over planetary influence. The court is not loud, it is observant, and observation leads to questions. What does opium actually do to the body? How does hashish change perception? Is altered consciousness divine or chemical? At first, the emperor is simply interested. He listens to his physicians describe the properties of plants imported from distant lands. Poppy resin, cannabis paste, mandrake root, henbane seeds, each described in careful medical language. Sedative, euphoric, hallucinatory, temporary. Everything is temporary, and that word gives permission. So the emperor tries a small dose, not for pain, not for boredom, for knowledge, just to understand. Because how can you rule over substances if you do not know their nature? It sounds reasonable. It sounds almost noble. The first experience is subtle. Colors soften. Music stretches. Thoughts loosen slightly. Nothing dramatic. The emperor feels in control, and control is the key. He is not indulging. He is studying. He asks the physician to record the effects, time of ingestion, behavioral changes, sleep patterns. He becomes fascinated. Now something shifts. The temporary experiment becomes repeated observation. Repeated observation becomes habit. Habit becomes environment. Soon, botanical gardens are cultivated not only for beauty, but for supply. Rare plants grown under supervision. Imported seeds tested. Dosage adjusted. And here is where curiosity becomes system. If the emperor experiments, so do the scholars. If the scholars experiment, so do the attendants. The court becomes a laboratory, and laboratories require subjects. History contains uncomfortable details here. Testing mixtures on prisoners, on servants, sometimes on animals, not from cruelty alone, from desire to measure, to know. Temporary trials, permanent normalization. The emperor convinces himself that understanding altered states makes him wiser. Perhaps it does. Perhaps it simply makes him detached, because something strange happens when rulers experiment with consciousness. Reality becomes flexible. Certainty becomes negotiable. Philosophy deepens, but urgency weakens. Decisions delay, because contemplation feels more important than action. And ministers adapt. They learn when the emperor is reflective. They learn when he prefers isolation. They learn when not to disturb. Again, no announcement, no decree, just adjustment. The empire learns the rhythm of intoxicated curiosity, and it spreads quietly. If the ruler publicly sponsors translations of pharmacological texts, apothecaries gain prestige. If altered states are studied rather than condemned, moral boundaries soften. Temporary scientific interest becomes cultural tolerance, and tolerance becomes expectation. Some visitors to such courts wrote of brilliance. Others wrote of oddities. An emperor discussing falconry one moment, then the nature of dreams the next. An afternoon lost in speculative astronomy. A midnight debate on whether intoxication reveals truth. No one sees addiction. They see intellect. But intellect can disguise dependency very elegantly. And then there are the accidents. Dosage miscalculated. Mandrake too strong. Henbane mismeasured. Delirium mistaken for revelation. When that happens, explanations follow quickly. Divine vision, spiritual insight, anything but chemical misjudgment. Because emperors do not err, their mixtures do, and mixtures can be corrected, or so they believe. Now, notice something. The sleepless king wanted rest. The troubled king wanted silence. The northern king wanted warmth. The emperor wants understanding. Different motives. Same path. A small experiment. A repeated solution. A permanent integration. And perhaps the most ironic part. Some of these rulers became famous for rational governance, for legal reform, for architectural innovation. And we cannot separate entirely where the inspiration ended and the intoxication began. Maybe they cannot either, and somewhere, in another castle, intoxication is not curiosity. It is paranoia, because power invites fear, and fear looks for relief. There is a certain stage of power where comfort no longer matters. Warmth is irrelevant. Sleep is optional. Curiosity is dangerous. What matters is survival. Imagine a king who trusts no one, not fully, not even the man pouring his wine. Especially not the man pouring his wine, because poison is easier than rebellion. Poison requires no army, only patience. So the king begins locking doors. Not metaphorically, literally. Multiple locks, multiple guards, different keys, food tasted by 3 people before reaching him, wine diluted, servants rotated constantly. Paranoia begins small, just caution. Temporary, always temporary, until the mind refuses to rest. Because suspicion does not sleep. It paces, it whispers, it invents scenarios. It reviews conversations from months ago and assigns them new meanings. And once again, someone brings a solution. Not to warm, not to experiment, to quiet suspicion. Opium is good for that. It dulls sharp edges of fear. Cannabis can soften intrusive thought. Alcohol slows the internal courtroom where everyone is guilty. Just enough to exhale. Just enough to stop replaying betrayal. Temporary relief. 1 night, 2 nights. Soon, the locked doors remain, but the king rests more easily behind them. Now something subtle happens. The king associates safety not only with guards, but with the draught. The cup becomes another lock, another layer of defense. Without it, fear returns, and fear is exhausting. So the cup becomes regular, not celebrated, not discussed, but constant. The apothecary now has unusual importance, because in a paranoid court, trust is currency, and the apothecary holds the formula. He controls the quiet. That is dangerous power. Sometimes the apothecary becomes the only person the king trusts, which is ironic, because the apothecary is literally the one most capable of poisoning him. History contains strange tensions like that, and as sedation increases, the king becomes less reactive, less explosive, which sounds good, but it also means hesitation, delayed punishment, delayed action. Ministers fill the gap because governance cannot pause every time the king needs reassurance. The temporary solution to fear becomes a stabilizer for the entire regime. No one would phrase it that way, but everyone adjusts to it. Meetings are scheduled after the evening draft when the king is calm. Sensitive topics are introduced when he is softened. Anger is avoided. It becomes almost an art form. Court choreography around chemical timing. Now imagine the absurd detail. A ruler surrounded by iron gates and armed guards, and yet feeling safest only after drinking something that blurs perception. The strongest man in the kingdom, needing sedation to endure his own thoughts. There is something almost human about that. Power magnifies fear. Fear invites remedy. Remedy becomes habit. Habit becomes structure. And sometimes the paranoia does not disappear. It simply changes flavor. Under sedation, suspicion becomes philosophical. Instead of accusing ministers openly, the king withdraws. Instead of shouting, he isolates. Isolation increases reliance on trusted few. Trusted few accumulate power. Again, without conspiracy, without violence, just gradual chemical adjustment. And the locked doors remain. But now they protect not only the body, they protect a ruler who cannot function without nightly reassurance. And if, one evening, the draught is weaker, if the dosage misjudged, if the apothecary hesitates, the entire court feels the shift immediately, because the king, without sedation, is sharper, more volatile, more unpredictable. The cup is no longer luxury, it is infrastructure. And somewhere, far away, another royal figure uses intoxication not for fear, not for curiosity, not for cold, but for performance. Because sometimes rulers must appear larger than life, and chemicals can help with that too. There is a difference between being powerful and appearing powerful. The first is structural, the second is theatrical, and medieval courts were nothing if not theatrical. Ceremonies lasted hours, entrances were choreographed, voices had to carry across stone halls. Gestures needed to feel deliberate, heavy, meaningful. But rulers are human. Human bodies tire, voices crack, nerves tighten before great appearances. So once again, a small solution. Not to sleep, not to quiet fear, not to experiment, but to perform. Imagine a king about to enter a cathedral filled with nobles. The air is thick with incense, the crowd restless. Expectations high, his hands tremble slightly. It would be inconvenient for a sovereign to appear nervous. So someone hands him wine, stronger than usual, fortified, maybe infused, just enough to steady the pulse. Temporary, always temporary, and it works. His voice lowers. His steps become heavier. He moves more slowly, more deliberately. Confidence is sometimes chemical, and when the performance succeeds, the solution stays. Soon, pre-ceremony drafts become normal. Before coronations, before proclamations, before negotiations. It is not indulgence. It is preparation. Actors rehearse. Rulers fortify. And something interesting begins to happen. The ruler associates authority with slight elevation. Sobriety feels smaller, quieter, less radiant, so the pre-ceremony ritual expands. Musicians play softer music during preparation. Attendants adjust garments while the cup is sipped. Apothecaries refine mixtures that sharpen speech without blurring it. A balance must be struck. Too much, and the performance collapses. Too little, and the aura fades. This requires calibration. And calibration becomes expertise. Soon, specific recipes are reserved for specific occasions. A stronger mixture for military announcements. A lighter one for diplomatic dinners. It sounds absurd, but human beings are predictable. If something enhances performance, it becomes part of routine, and routine becomes tradition. Young heirs grow up watching their fathers drink before addressing crowds. They learn that elevation equals presence. They imitate, and what began as one ruler's insecurity becomes generational culture. Imagine the irony. A sovereign who must chemically amplify himself to appear naturally sovereign. But the crowd does not know. They see a steady voice, a commanding posture, a king who seems carved from certainty. They do not see the warm current beneath his composure. And occasionally, mistakes happen. A ceremony that stretches longer than expected. A dosage slightly too high. Words slur faintly. Laughter arrives at the wrong moment. Courtiers pretend it is passion. Historians later call it charisma. But inside the private chamber, adjustments are made. Less henbane, more diluted wine, careful refinement, because performance is delicate. Now, notice something subtle. The sleepless king drank to endure pain. The paranoid king drank to endure fear. The northern king drank to endure cold. The emperor experimented to endure boredom. This ruler drinks to endure expectation, and expectation may be the heaviest burden of all, because power is not only about decision-making, it is about presence. And presence is exhausting, especially when hundreds of eyes measure every breath. So the solution remains. Not excessive, not chaotic, just integrated. Integrated so smoothly that eventually no one remembers when ceremonies were ever conducted without a preparatory draft. And here is the quiet consequence. When rulers rely on chemical steadiness for public life, private life shifts too. Dinner conversations extend. Music becomes richer. Feasts blur into night. And sometimes the line between performance and pleasure dissolves, because If a substance helps you be magnificent in public, why not remain slightly magnificent in private? And so, evenings stretch longer, and mornings grow slower, and governance once again reorganizes around a subtle rhythm of elevation and recovery. No revolution, no scandal, just habit, and habit shapes centuries. And somewhere else, in a quieter chamber, a queen discovers that intoxication can do something entirely different. Not amplify, not quiet, not warm, but soften grief. Grief behaves differently in a palace. It does not cry loudly, it echoes quietly. Imagine a queen whose husband is gone, not dramatically in battle, but slowly. Illness, fever, infection, the kind that lingers and then disappears. A person in stages. The court continues functioning. Servants still bow. Letters still arrive. Meals are still prepared. But the chair beside her remains empty. And emptiness in a large stone chamber is loud. At first, she does not reach for anything. She prays. She reads. She walks in the garden. Temporary distractions. But evenings are long, too long. Medieval nights stretch endlessly when you cannot sleep. Candles burn slowly. The sound of wind through narrow windows feels amplified, and the mind begins replaying memories in loops. So someone suggests a cordial just to help rest, honey and wine, perhaps a touch of poppy, nothing dramatic, just enough to quiet the replaying thoughts. Temporary, always temporary. The first night it works gently. Her breathing slows. The edge of sorrow softens, not erased, just blurred. And that blur is merciful, because grief, when sharp, feels physical. It tightens the chest. It stiffens the neck. It presses behind the eyes. So the cordial returns the next evening. Then the next. Soon it is prepared automatically as twilight approaches. Servants learn the timing. Candles lit. Curtains drawn. Cup placed beside her reading chair. No announcement. No scandal. Just ritual. And rituals are comforting, even when they are chemical. Now something subtle begins to happen. The queen associates evening calm with the cordial. Without it, the silence feels raw. With it, silence feels padded. And padding becomes necessary, because royal grief cannot be public forever. After a few months, the court expects composure, strength, dignity. So the cordial shifts from private comfort to functional tool. Before audiences, before ceremonies marking anniversaries, before speaking of the deceased, a small dose ensures steadiness. And steadiness becomes reputation. She bore her sorrow with grace. Historians later write, they do not mention the measured grains of opium dissolved in honey. And here is where the loop deepens. Ladies in waiting notice. Some begin requesting similar mixtures for their own anxieties. Widows in noble families adopt the ritual. Recipes circulate quietly. What began as one queen's attempt to survive evenings becomes aristocratic custom, not indulgence, not rebellion, just softening. And over time, the cordial strengthens, because tolerance is patient. It does not rush. It waits. A little more poppy, a little less dilution. The evenings grow thicker, mornings slightly slower, correspondence delayed, decisions postponed until after breakfast. Again, governance adjusts. Not dramatically, just gently. Now imagine the irony. A queen praised for composure, relying nightly on sedation to maintain it. A symbol of resilience, privately unable to face silence, unaided. There is something profoundly human there. Power does not eliminate grief. It amplifies isolation. And isolation seeks relief. And relief, once found, resists departure. If someone suggests reducing the cordial, she hesitates. Not because she loves being high, but because she fears the rawness returning. And so it remains, for years, perhaps decades, integrated so completely into nightly rhythm that no one questions it, until a successor attempts reform. And reform feels cruel, because what looks like indulgence from outside may be survival from within. Now notice again pain, fear, cold, curiosity, performance, grief, different doorways, same corridor, a small solution, a repeated gesture, a permanent fixture in royal life. And somewhere else, in another court entirely, intoxication is not private at all. It is collective, shared openly, celebrated, because sometimes rulers do not hide elevation. They build culture around it. There are moments in history when intoxication stops pretending to be medicine. It stops whispering. It stops hiding in bedside cups. And instead, it moves into the hall. Imagine a royal court during a festival. Torches burning along stone walls. Musicians filling the air with layered rhythms. Silk moving in waves. Laughter overlapping. This is not insulation against cold. Not sedation for grief. Not an experiment. This is collective elevation. At first, festivals are seasonal. Harvest completed. Victory achieved. A royal marriage sealed. Wine flows because celebration requires it. Temporary. Always temporary. But festivals are persuasive, because when intoxication is shared, it becomes less suspicious. No one is alone with their cup. The king drinks. The nobles drink. The ambassadors drink. Music grows louder. Boundaries soften. Hierarchy blurs. And for a few hours, power feels warm rather than heavy. That feeling is addictive. Not chemically, necessarily, but socially. The court begins to crave those nights. So festivals increase. Not dramatically, just slightly. An additional celebration here. A saint's day observed more elaborately there. A diplomatic reception extended into midnight. Temporary extensions. Permanent expectation. Now, something subtle shifts. If intoxication helps diplomacy, it becomes strategic. Ambassadors offered stronger wine. Sweetened confections infused discreetly. Negotiations conducted after the third course. Words become looser. Concessions easier. Temporary leverage becomes habitual tactic. And when a tactic works, it survives. Soon, visiting envoys expect generosity. They expect indulgence. A court known for lavish, intoxicated feasts earns reputation. Reputation becomes identity, and identity resists change. Imagine the irony. A kingdom's diplomatic style shaped partly by fermentation, policies softened by honeyed cannabis sweets, treaties sealed under a haze of music and sherbet. Historians later call it charm. They do not describe the slow warmth spreading behind the eyes of negotiators, and the cultural layer deepens. Poetry written in praise of altered states, songs celebrating ecstatic evenings, artists depicting feasts in glowing color. Intoxication becomes aesthetic. It becomes art, and art legitimizes habit. Now, young princes grow up not watching a father hide his draught in private, but watching elevation woven into public life. They do not associate it with weakness. They associate it with joy, with generosity, with power displayed through abundance. And abundance becomes performance. Because if your court is known for celebration, you must maintain it. Cellars expand. Supply chains intensify. Merchants prioritized for spice and resin. Temporary celebration becomes logistical planning because culture requires maintenance. And sometimes, of course, the line blurs. Celebration extends into excess, excess into scandal. But courts are skilled at reframing. What one observer calls decadence, another calls magnificence. And magnificence is politically useful, especially when rival courts are austere. Now notice something repeating. Pain led to nightly draughts. Fear led to guarded sedation. Grief led to honeyed cordials. Performance led to fortified wine. And celebration leads to normalization. The difference here is visibility. When intoxication is shared openly, it shapes identity faster. It spreads beyond the ruler. It becomes expected behavior among elites. And once elites adopt something, it trickles downward. Merchants imitate. Lesser nobles copy recipes. Urban centers attempt smaller versions of royal feasts. Temporary court fashion becomes regional culture. And culture, once formed, is stubborn. Even if a later ruler wishes to tighten discipline, he risks appearing joyless, weak, ungenerous. So reform stalls. Because people remember the warmth, they remember the laughter, they remember how light the world felt under torchlight, and memory is persuasive. Now imagine the quiet consequence. If a court is often elevated, sober mornings feel sharper, administrative work postponed, documents left unread until midday. Again, governance adjusts, slowly, softly. The rhythm of celebration seeps into daily life, and somewhere, far from music and torchlight, another ruler is discovering something else entirely. That intoxication can become not ritual, not celebration, but escape, not from grief, not from cold, but from responsibility itself. There is a particular exhaustion that comes not from cold, not from grief, not from fear, but from deciding every day, every hour, petitions about land, disputes over inheritance, border conflicts, church, pressure, noble rivalry, trade complaints, tax, shortages, and none of it ever stops. Imagine a ruler who wakes each morning already behind, already late, already aware that whatever decision he makes will anger someone powerful. At first, He tries discipline, early rising, short meals, direct hearings, temporary resolve. But human resolve erodes, especially under constant scrutiny. And so one afternoon, during a particularly long council, he accepts a cup, not before ceremony, not before sleep, just during, because the conversation feels endless, the voices repetitive, the arguments circular. The cup makes it softer, not clearer, just softer, and softer feels survivable, temporary, always temporary. The next day, he waits longer before accepting it, then shorter, then eventually the cup appears without request, placed near his hand during long hearings. No announcement, no confession, just quiet assistance. Now something almost invisible begins to happen. He postpones decisions slightly more often. Let us consider this tomorrow. Return next week. We will review it further. Under mild elevation, urgency dissolves. Tomorrow feels adequate, and tomorrow becomes habit. Ministers learn quickly. If the ruler delays, someone must act. Committees form. Delegations expand. Signatures are sometimes prepared in advance. The ruler still holds authority, but increasingly, he does not exercise it immediately. Temporary mental relief becomes structural diffusion of power, and diffusion feels peaceful for him. Because fewer immediate choices means less pressure, less confrontation, less blame. The cup becomes associated not just with calm, but with avoidance. Avoidance is powerful, especially when you are tired of disappointing everyone. Now imagine the absurdity. The most powerful individual in the realm, slowly surrendering daily control, not through revolution, but through mild intoxication. He is not incapacitated, not collapsed, just less present, and presence is everything. Court factions grow confident, petitions filtered before reaching him, controversial matters quietly resolved elsewhere. All because one ruler preferred decisions to feel less sharp. And perhaps he tells himself it is strategic. Delegation strengthens the state. Ministers need autonomy. He is modernizing governance. And perhaps he is. But he is also drifting. Because when intoxication becomes the bridge between you and responsibility, sobriety feels like standing alone on stone again, cold, exposed, demanding, and humans, even royal ones, avoid discomfort. The pattern deepens. Morning hearings begin later. Afternoons stretch. Evenings blur into quiet chambers. The apothecary refines mixtures that lift mood without causing obvious impairment. Subtlety is essential because visible excess invites rebellion, but quiet softness invites dependence. Now notice something. Pain sought relief. Fear sought reassurance. Grief sought softness. Celebration sought joy. Performance sought confidence. This ruler seeks escape from decision itself, and decision fatigue is ancient, though we rarely call it that. We call it weakness, or laziness, or decadence. But perhaps it was simply exhaustion. And exhaustion, when medicated nightly, becomes rhythm. And rhythm becomes personality. Historians later describe such rulers as indecisive, detached, withdrawn. They rarely ask what was in the cup, and somewhere else, far beyond these courts, there are rulers who do not drift gently into dependence. They fall harder, because sometimes the temporary solution is not subtle. Sometimes it is overwhelming. And once you have experienced overwhelming elevation, returning to ordinary consciousness feels unbearably small. Not every ruler drifted slowly. Some accelerated. Imagine a young prince raised inside celebration, raised watching wine poured before speeches, watching sweet confections passed after feasts, watching older rulers soften themselves for comfort, for ceremony, for negotiation. To him, elevation is normal. It is not secret. It is not shameful. It is part of adulthood. And youth does not calibrate carefully. Youth tests limits. The first experience is intense, not subtle, not controlled. Perhaps hashish taken in greater quantity than advised. Perhaps opium stronger than measured. Perhaps alcohol layered over both. The world tilts. Colors stretch. Time slows dramatically. Music becomes enormous. And the prince laughs because he has never felt that expanded before. Temporary, always temporary, except the memory lingers. Ordinary consciousness afterward feels small, muted, flat, and here is the danger. When a young ruler first tastes overwhelming elevation, moderation feels disappointing, so dosage increases. Not because of pain, not because of fear, but because ordinary reality feels insufficient. Now something changes more visibly. He sleeps irregularly. He misses morning councils. He prefers night gatherings, where light is dim and perception altered. Ministers adjust reluctantly. But unlike the tired ruler who delegated quietly, this prince disrupts rhythm entirely. Unpredictable moods, sudden enthusiasm for grand projects at midnight, sudden indifference by morning. Courtiers oscillate with him. Infrastructure struggles to keep pace. Temporary excess becomes instability, and instability invites criticism. Whispers begin. He indulges too much. He is not serious, but he feels alive, more alive under elevation than during sober administration. That feeling is persuasive because ruling in daylight is repetitive, but ruling at night under heightened perception feels mythic. He imagines himself visionary, prophetic, different, and sometimes he is. Some rulers under heavy intoxication proposed bold architectural designs, unusual policies, dramatic reforms. But the same intensity that fuels vision also fuels volatility. All or nothing. Build enormous palaces, or abandon projects entirely. Punish harshly, or forgive irrationally. Ministers scramble, because dependency at this level is no longer quiet. It is visible. Now the apothecary holds extraordinary influence. He controls supply. He moderates strength. He becomes gatekeeper to the prince's preferred reality, and gatekeepers accumulate leverage. Some princes trusted apothecaries more than generals, which is ironic, because one holds the sword, the other holds the dream. And when tolerance grows severe, stronger substances are introduced. More refined opium, denser cannabis resin, distilled alcohol rather than fermented. The body adapts, requires more, and mornings become harder. Sweat, irritation, restlessness. Suddenly the prince is not seeking elevation, he is seeking normality, because without the substance, equilibrium vanishes. Temporary experimentation becomes biological reliance, and here the loop tightens dramatically. If the ruler cannot function without intoxication, governance becomes hostage to supply. Trade routes matter more. Storage matters more. Security around apothecaries intensifies. Temporary indulgence becomes geopolitical concern. Imagine treaties influenced not by ideology, but by access to resin shipments. It sounds exaggerated. It rarely is. Now the tragedy. Some of these princes never learned moderation. Their reigns shortened, their reputations tarnished, their excess blamed entirely on character. History loves moral explanations. It dislikes chemical ones. But behind many erratic decisions, there may have been trembling hands at dawn. And yet even here, the pattern echoes earlier themes. The sleepless king wanted rest. The grieving queen wanted softness. The paranoid ruler wanted quiet. The celebratory court wanted joy. This prince wants intensity, and intensity rarely stabilizes. It consumes, and once consumed, recovery feels like loss. And somewhere else, in a different century, there is a ruler who does not consume for escape, nor for intensity, but because the court itself demands it. Because sometimes dependence is not personal, it is imposed. Imagine a boy crowned too young, too early to understand the weight, too early to refuse the rituals already built around him. He does not invent the culture, he inherits it. When he enters the hall for the first time as sovereign, the rhythm already exists. Morning audiences softened with fortified wine. Afternoon receptions scented with sweet resin smoke. Evening banquets flowing into night. He watches. At first, he declines politely, because youth sometimes mistakes restraint for strength. But decline creates discomfort. Nobles exchange glances. Ambassadors raise brows. Refusal feels like rejection, because intoxication here is not private weakness. It is shared identity. To refuse the cup is to refuse the bond. So he accepts, just a little. Temporary compliance. Always temporary. The warmth spreads. The music feels layered, the laughter easier. He notices how conversations become less rigid, diplomacy smoother. Even tension dissolves faster when everyone shares a mild elevation. So he accepts again the next evening, and the next, not because he craves it, but because the court expects it. And expectation is heavier than addiction. Soon, attendants prepare the cup without asking. It is part of the entrance ritual. Crown adjusted, cloak draped, cup offered. Declining would interrupt choreography, and courts hate interruption. Now something subtle begins to shift. He begins associating authority not with solitude, but with shared intoxication. He feels closer to nobles when elevated, less judged, less scrutinized, more human, which is dangerous, because the ruler who feels comfortable only within softened boundaries avoids sober confrontation, hard decisions delayed until after shared feasts, criticism deflected with laughter. Temporary social lubricant becomes structural avoidance, but this time the dependence is not entirely his, it is collective. If he attempted reform, if he banned certain mixtures, he would face resistance, not from enemies, but from allies, because intoxication here is glue. It holds the social fabric together. Feasts build loyalty. Shared elevation builds intimacy. Intimacy reduces rebellion, or at least that is the belief. And beliefs are powerful. Now imagine the irony. A ruler who might not personally need intoxication, but must participate to maintain legitimacy, because sobriety appears distant, cold, judgmental, whereas shared indulgence feels generous, approachable. So he continues, and over time, the body adapts anyway, even if the first cups were taken reluctantly, even if the intention was social harmony. Tolerance does not care about motive. It builds quietly. And one day, he realizes that evenings without the ritual feel incomplete, not unbearable, just lacking. And that is enough. Temporary participation becomes personal habit. Habit becomes necessity. And necessity becomes identity. Foreign observers describe his court as vibrant, open, warm. They do not see the subtle pressure that sustains the rhythm. They do not see how difficult it would be for him to step outside of it, because when culture itself revolves around elevation, sobriety becomes rebellion. And rebellion, even internal rebellion, is exhausting. So he does not rebel, he adapts. And the culture continues. Now notice how this differs from the reckless prince. That was excess. This is absorption. Absorption into expectation. And expectation can be more powerful than craving, because craving can be resisted. Expectation punishes refusal. And once again, governance shifts quietly. Late mornings normalized. Important discussions paired with shared cups. Reform proposals softened into suggestion. No dramatic collapse, just gentle blur. And somewhere else, in another era entirely, there is a ruler who uses intoxication not to soften, not to celebrate, not to escape, but to punish himself, because guilt is another kind of cold. There is a particular exhaustion that comes not from cold, not from grief, not from fear, but from deciding every day, every hour, petitions about land, disputes over inheritance, border conflicts, church pressure, noble rivalry, trade complaints, tax shortages, and none of it ever stops. Imagine a ruler who wakes each morning already behind, already late, already aware that whatever decision he makes will anger someone powerful. At first, he tries discipline, early rising, short meals, direct hearings, temporary resolve. But human resolve erodes, especially under constant scrutiny. And so one afternoon, during a particularly long council, he accepts a cup, not before ceremony, not before sleep, just during, because the conversation feels endless. The voices repetitive. The arguments circular. The cup makes it softer, not clearer, just softer. And softer feels survivable. Temporary, always temporary. The next day, he waits longer before accepting it, then shorter. Then eventually, the cup appears without request, placed near his hand during long hearings. No announcement, no confession, just quiet assistance. Now something almost invisible begins to happen. He postpones decisions slightly more often. Let us consider this tomorrow. Return next week. We will review it further. Under mild elevation, urgency dissolves. Tomorrow feels adequate. And tomorrow becomes habit. Ministers learn quickly. If the ruler delays, someone must act. Committees form. Delegations expand. Signatures are sometimes prepared in advance. The ruler still holds authority, but increasingly, he does not exercise it immediately. Temporary mental relief becomes structural diffusion of power, and diffusion feels peaceful for him, because fewer immediate choices means less pressure, less confrontation, less blame. The cup becomes associated not just with calm, but with avoidance. Avoidance is powerful, especially when you are tired of disappointing everyone. Now imagine the absurdity. The most powerful individual in the realm, slowly surrendering daily control, not through revolution, but through mild intoxication. He is not incapacitated, not collapsed, just less present. And presence is everything. Court factions grow confident, petitions filtered before reaching him, controversial matters quietly resolved elsewhere. All because one ruler preferred decisions to feel less sharp, and perhaps, he tells himself, it is strategic. Delegation strengthens the state. Ministers need autonomy. He is modernizing governance, and perhaps he is, but he is also drifting. Because when intoxication becomes the bridge between you and responsibility, sobriety feels like standing alone on stone again, cold, exposed, demanding. And humans, even royal ones, avoid discomfort. The pattern deepens. Morning hearings begin later. Afternoons stretch. Evenings blur into quiet chambers. The apothecary refines mixtures that lift mood without causing obvious impairment. Subtlety is essential because visible excess invites rebellion, but quiet softness invites dependence. Now, notice something. Pain sought relief. Fear sought reassurance. Grief sought softness. Celebration sought joy. Performance sought confidence. This ruler seeks escape from decision itself, and decision fatigue is ancient, though we rarely call it that. We call it weakness, or laziness, or decadence. But perhaps it was simply exhaustion. And exhaustion, when medicated nightly, becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes personality. Historians later describe such rulers as indecisive, detached, withdrawn. They rarely ask what was in the cup, and somewhere else, far beyond these courts. There are rulers who do not drift gently into dependence. They fall harder, because sometimes the temporary solution is not subtle. Sometimes it is overwhelming. And once you have experienced overwhelming elevation, returning to ordinary consciousness feels unbearably small. Not every ruler drifted slowly. Some accelerated. Imagine a young prince raised inside celebration, raised watching wine poured before speeches, watching sweet confections passed after feasts, watching older rulers soften themselves for comfort, for ceremony, for negotiation. To him, elevation is normal. It is not secret. It is not shameful. It is part of adulthood. And youth does not calibrate carefully. Youth tests limits. The first experience is intense, not subtle, not controlled. Perhaps hashish taken in greater quantity than advised. Perhaps opium stronger than measured. Perhaps alcohol layered over both. The world tilts. Colors stretch. Time slows dramatically. Music becomes enormous. And the prince laughs because he has never felt that expanded before. Temporary. Always temporary. Except the memory lingers. Ordinary consciousness afterward feels small, muted, flat. And here is the danger. When a young ruler first tastes overwhelming elevation, moderation feels disappointing. So dosage increases. Not because of pain, not because of fear, but because ordinary reality feels insufficient. Now, something changes more visibly. He sleeps irregularly. He misses morning councils. He prefers night gatherings, where light is dim and perception altered. Ministers adjust reluctantly. But unlike the tired ruler who delegated quietly, this prince disrupts rhythm entirely. Unpredictable moods. Sudden enthusiasm for grand projects at midnight. Sudden indifference by morning. Courtiers oscillate with him. Infrastructure struggles to keep pace. Temporary excess becomes instability, and instability invites criticism. Whispers begin. He indulges too much. He is not serious, but he feels alive, more alive under elevation than during sober administration. That feeling is persuasive, because ruling in daylight is repetitive, but ruling at night, under heightened perception, feels mythic. He imagines himself visionary, prophetic, different, and sometimes he is. Some rulers, under heavy intoxication, proposed bold architectural designs, unusual policies, dramatic reforms. But the same intensity that fuels vision also fuels volatility, all or nothing. Build enormous palaces, or abandon projects entirely, punish harshly, or forgive irrationally. Ministers scramble, because dependency at this level is no longer quiet. It is visible. Now the apothecary holds extraordinary influence. He controls supply. He moderates strength. He becomes gatekeeper to the prince's preferred reality. And gatekeepers accumulate leverage. Some princes trusted apothecaries more than generals, which is ironic, because one holds the sword, the other holds the dream, and when tolerance grows severe, stronger substances are introduced. More refined opium, denser cannabis resin, distilled alcohol rather than fermented. The body adapts, requires more, and mornings become harder. Sweat, irritation, restlessness. Suddenly, the prince is not seeking elevation. He is seeking normality, because without the substance, equilibrium vanishes. Temporary experimentation becomes biological reliance. And here the loop tightens dramatically. If the ruler cannot function without intoxication, governance becomes hostage to supply. Trade routes matter more. Storage matters more. Security around apothecaries intensifies. Temporary indulgence becomes geopolitical concern. Imagine treaties influenced not by ideology, but by access to resin shipments. It sounds exaggerated. It rarely is. Now the tragedy. Some of these princes never learned moderation. Their reigns shortened, their reputations tarnished, their excess blamed entirely on character. History loves moral explanations. It dislikes chemical ones. But behind many erratic decisions, there may have been trembling hands at dawn. And yet even here, the pattern echoes earlier themes. The sleepless king wanted rest. The grieving queen wanted softness. The paranoid ruler wanted quiet. The celebratory court wanted joy. This prince wants intensity, and intensity rarely stabilizes. It consumes. And once consumed, recovery feels like loss. And somewhere else, in a different century, there is a ruler who does not consume for escape, nor for intensity, but because the court itself demands it, because sometimes dependence is not personal, it is imposed. Imagine a boy crowned too young, too early to understand the weight, too early to refuse the rituals already built around him. He does not invent the culture, he inherits it. When he enters the hall for the first time as sovereign, the rhythm already exists. Morning audiences softened with fortified wine. Afternoon receptions scented with sweet resin smoke. Evening banquets flowing into night. He watches. At first, he declines politely, because youth sometimes mistakes restraint for strength. But decline creates discomfort. Nobles exchange glances. Ambassadors raise brows. Refusal feels like rejection, because intoxication here is not private weakness. It is shared identity. To refuse the cup is to refuse the bond. So he accepts. Just a little. Temporary compliance. Always temporary. The warmth spreads. The music feels layered. The laughter easier. He notices how conversations become less rigid, diplomacy smoother. Even tension dissolves faster when everyone shares a mild elevation. So he accepts again the next evening, and the next, not because he craves it, but because the court expects it. And expectation is heavier than addiction. Soon, attendants prepare the cup without asking. It is part of the entrance ritual. Crown adjusted, cloak draped, cup offered. Declining would interrupt choreography, and courts hate interruption. Now something subtle begins to shift. He begins associating authority not with solitude, but with shared intoxication. He feels closer to nobles when elevated, less judged, less scrutinized, more human, which is dangerous. Because the ruler who feels comfortable only within softened boundaries, avoids sober confrontation, hard decisions delayed until after shared feasts, criticism deflected with laughter. Temporary social lubricant becomes structural avoidance, but this time the dependence is not entirely his, it is collective. If he attempted reform, if he banned certain mixtures, he would face resistance not from enemies, but from allies, because intoxication here is glue. It holds the social fabric together. Feasts build loyalty. Shared elevation builds intimacy. Intimacy reduces rebellion. Or at least, that is the belief. And beliefs are powerful. Now imagine the irony. A ruler who might not personally need intoxication, but must participate to maintain legitimacy, because sobriety appears distant, cold, judgmental, whereas shared indulgence feels generous, approachable. So he continues, and over time, the body adapts anyway, even if the first cups were taken reluctantly. Even if the intention was social harmony, tolerance does not care about motive. It builds quietly, and one day he realizes that evenings without the ritual feel incomplete, not unbearable, just lacking, and that is enough. Temporary participation becomes personal habit. Habit becomes necessity, and necessity becomes identity. Foreign observers describe his court as vibrant, open, warm. They do not see the subtle pressure that sustains the rhythm. They do not see how difficult it would be for him to step outside of it, because when culture itself revolves around elevation, sobriety becomes rebellion. And rebellion, even internal rebellion, is exhausting. So he does not rebel, he adapts. And the culture continues. Now notice how this differs from the reckless prince. That was excess. This is absorption. Absorption into expectation. And expectation can be more powerful than craving, because craving can be resisted. Expectation punishes refusal. And once again, governance shifts quietly. Late mornings normalized. Important discussions paired with shared cups. Reform proposals softened into suggestion. No dramatic collapse, just gentle blur. And somewhere else, in another era entirely, there is a ruler who uses intoxication not to soften, not to celebrate, not to escape, but to punish himself. Because guilt is another kind of cold. There are decisions that echo, a battle ordered too quickly, an execution signed too confidently, a treaty broken too easily. At the moment of decision, everything feels necessary, strategic, justified. But time has a way of softening certainty, and in that softness, doubt seeps in. Imagine a ruler who ordered a punishment that later proved excessive. Perhaps a noble executed. Perhaps a rebellion crushed too brutally. Publicly, he remains firm. Privately, memory lingers. He replays the moment, the signature, the accusation, the face of the condemned. At first, he resists relief because guilt feels deserved, temporary suffering, self-imposed. But nights grow longer, and sleep avoids him, because guilt is loudest when the court grows quiet. So again, a cup appears, not suggested by a physician this time, chosen by the ruler himself, a stronger mixture than usual. He does not ask for dilution. He wants depth, temporary numbing, just to stop replaying, just to quiet the imagined voice, asking, was it necessary? The first night works. Thoughts slow, images blur, the face fades. Relief. And relief after guilt feels almost dangerous, because if intoxication can soften conscience, it can also reshape it. Soon, the ruler begins pairing difficult decisions with evening sedation. Order signed in daylight, cup taken at dusk. Cause and relief become linked. He does not consciously think this, but the body learns, the mind learns. Decision leads to discomfort. Discomfort leads to intoxication. Temporary coping becomes conditioned response. Now something subtle shifts in moral calculation. If guilt can be managed chemically, future decisions feel less intimidating. Harsh choices become tolerable because the night offers escape. This is not villainy, it is human psychology amplified by power. And the irony is sharp. The very mechanism that softens remorse may enable repetition. Because if consequences are emotionally blunted, restraint weakens. Now imagine the internal conflict. He knows he relies on the draft. He may even resent it. He may fast for days in penance, attend Mass intensely, seek confession. But confession does not erase memory, and memory returns. So the cup returns again. Temporary mercy, permanent cycle. Over time, evenings grow heavier, not celebratory, not curious, dense. He drinks alone, in chambers, closed to music, closed to laughter. This is not shared elevation. This is private anesthesia, and private habits are harder to regulate because no one sees, no one calibrates dosage. Tolerance increases quietly. He may appear stern in public, composed, severe, but severity can hide dependence, because stern rulers are rarely questioned about their private rituals. Now notice something repeating again. Pain led to relief, fear led to sedation, cold led to warmth, performance led to amplification, exhaustion led to escape, culture led to absorption, and guilt leads to self-numbing. Different doorways, same corridor, temporary solution, permanent integration. And here is the quiet tragedy. The ruler might believe he is punishing himself through reliance, but in truth, he is preserving functionality, because without intoxication, remorse might paralyze him entirely. So the habit stays integrated into moral survival, and somewhere else, in a different court, in a different century, there is a ruler who does not use intoxication to forget the past, but to imagine the future, because sometimes elevation feels visionary, and vision, too, can become addictive. Some rulers drink to forget, others drink to remember nothing, but a few drink to see more, or at least that is what they believe. Imagine a ruler obsessed with legacy, not daily governance, not petty disputes, but monuments, cathedrals that pierce the sky, cities redesigned, roads stretching farther than anyone thought possible. Ambition can be exhausting, but it can also be intoxicating on its own. Now imagine adding something that makes ambition feel limitless. A resin sweetened and folded into fruit paste. A draught infused lightly with poppy and herbs. Not enough to sedate, enough to expand. He takes it before reviewing architectural sketches, before long discussions with engineers, before staring at unfinished foundations. At first, it feels like clarity. Ideas flow faster. Connections form more easily. He sees domes where others see ceilings. He imagines towers rising higher than stone should allow. Temporary enhancement, always temporary. But the experience is persuasive, because under elevation, doubt recedes, and doubt is the natural enemy of grand projects. Without doubt, everything feels possible, and possibility is addictive. Soon, the ruler associates creativity with mild intoxication, blueprint sessions paired with sweetened wine, urban planning discussed under the haze of scented smoke. He may not even call it intoxication. He may call it inspiration. And inspiration, once ritualized, becomes expectation. Architects begin scheduling design meetings at specific hours, after the ruler's preferred draft, because that is when he is most enthusiastic, most visionary. Ministers learn to present bold ideas during those windows, because rejection is less likely. Temporary creative boost becomes structural encouragement for expansion. Now something subtle shifts. Projects multiply. Ambition escalates. Budgets stretch, because under elevated perception, scale feels manageable, risk feels distant, and caution feels small. And yet, some of these rulers leave behind astonishing works: cathedrals, fortifications, palaces. Historians praise their vision. They do not measure their blood chemistry. But there is irony here, because the same elevation that fuels vision can also obscure feasibility. Some projects collapse, some remain unfinished, some bankrupt treasuries. And when sober reality returns, it feels constricting. Paperwork suffocates, accountants complain, advisors warn. So the ruler takes another draft, not to forget guilt, not to avoid fear, but to re-enter the expansive state, the state where obstacles shrink, temporary return, permanent reliance, and gradually the ruler finds ordinary consciousness disappointing. Meetings feel dull, numbers feel tedious, reality feels narrow. Only under slight elevation does the future feel grand enough. And so mornings are endured, afternoons anticipated, evenings expanded. Now notice again the echo. Pain sought numbness, fear sought quiet, grief sought softness, performance sought charisma, exhaustion sought escape, guilt sought mercy. Vision seeks expansion, and expansion is intoxicating even without substance. Add substance, and the line blurs, because sometimes The ruler may not realize where ambition ends and intoxication begins. He may believe his brilliance is entirely his own, and perhaps it is, but the ritual remains. The cup before the blueprint, the sweet before the dream, integrated, invisible, and somewhere else, in colder stone chambers, a final pattern repeats quietly, because sometimes intoxication does not begin with pain or ambition. It begins with childhood, with medicine given too early, and habits formed before choice was possible. Before he was a king, he was a sickly child. Medieval childhood for royalty was not gentle. Fevers were common, teething painful, sleep irregular, wet nurses exhausted, and in noble households, remedies were efficient. A crying infant disrupts the court. A restless child interrupts tutors. A feverish air terrifies dynasties. So someone mixes a little poppy into honey. Not much, just enough to calm. Just enough to help him sleep. Temporary, always temporary. Except it works. He sleeps deeply. The household relaxes. The nurse rests. The physician nods approvingly. And so, the next time he cries too long, the mixture returns. When he coughs, when he fusses, when he refuses lessons, a small dose, measured carefully, because it is medicine, not indulgence. Over months, then years, the body learns this rhythm. Discomfort equals sweetness. Restlessness equals relief. He does not know life without it. By adolescence, the mixtures are lighter, less obvious, but present. Perhaps infused in wine, perhaps added discreetly to tonics for nerves. He studies, he trains, he learns diplomacy, always with subtle chemical cushioning beneath stress. And here is where something profound happens. His baseline is different. He has never experienced adulthood without sedation threaded lightly through it. Not heavily, not dramatically, just enough. So, when he ascends the throne, he does not reach for intoxication as a solution. It is already integrated, already normal, already invisible. And unlike the reckless prince who sought intensity, or the grieving queen who sought comfort, this ruler does not even think of it as escape. It is simply part of being. Morning tonic, evening cordial, occasional strengthening during illness, temporary treatments extended across decades, permanent physiology. Now imagine trying to remove it. If a reform-minded physician suggests reducing dosage, he feels strange, irritable, unsettled. Not because he craves euphoria, but because equilibrium has shifted. His nervous system adapted years ago, and adaptation is stubborn. So the habit continues, quietly, unremarkable. No scandal, no collapse, just steady dependence woven so seamlessly into life that historians never notice. They write of his policies, his wars, his marriages. They do not write about the honey stirred gently into warm wine before bed. And yet, that honey may have shaped his temperament, softened his anger, blurred his decisiveness, or perhaps preserved his stability. We cannot know, because when intoxication begins in childhood, it feels like personality. not substance. And that may be the quietest pattern of all. Temporary relief given to a crying infant, becoming the invisible architecture of an adult monarch's inner world. Now, pause. Notice how every path led here. Pain, fear, cold, ambition, performance, grief, exhaustion, guilt, celebration, curiosity, all temporary doors, all opening into permanence. Not because medieval rulers loved being high in the modern sense, but because small mercies accumulate, one cup at a time, one evening at a time, one generation watching the previous one lift a cup and breathe easier. And perhaps that is the most human detail of all, because behind crowns and armies and treaties there were simply bodies, cold bodies, tired bodies, lonely bodies, ambitious bodies, seeking relief, and relief, when found, rarely leaves willingly. And somewhere, even now, in some quiet room, lit by a single candle, a ruler reaches for a cup that was meant to be temporary, and does not question it. If you step back now, just slightly, if you imagine all those rooms at once, stone chambers in the north, sunlit courtyards in the south, private grief-lit bedrooms, noisy festival halls, war tents, cathedral entrances, architectural studios, scattered with parchment, you might begin to notice something simple. It was never really about the substance, not the opium, not the wine, not the hashish folded into honey, not the fortified draught before ceremony. Those were tools, sometimes clumsy tools, sometimes dangerous ones, but tools. What mattered was what they were trying to solve. A shoulder that would not stop aching, a mind that would not stop racing, a winter that would not end, a memory that would not fade, a crowd that expected magnificence, a council that never stopped arguing, a future that felt too small unless expanded. Power magnifies everything. Pain hurts more when you cannot show weakness. Grief isolates more when no one can sit beside you honestly. Fear deepens when betrayal could topple a dynasty. Expectation suffocates when every gesture is measured, and in that pressure, small mercies feel enormous. A cup becomes silence. A sweet becomes warmth. A smoke becomes imagination. A cordial becomes sleep. Temporary, always temporary, until repetition turns mercy into structure, and structure into culture, and culture into identity. Some rulers drifted gently into habit. Some fell hard into excess. Some inherited the rhythm before they could speak. Some justified it as medicine. Some reframed it as inspiration. Some hid it. Some celebrated it openly. But beneath all of it was something very ordinary, human limitation. The myth of the medieval ruler is often carved in marble, unshakable, unbending, sovereign. But marble cracks, bodies ache, minds unravel, hearts grieve, hands tremble before a crowd. And so, across centuries and continents, one pattern repeats quietly. When reality becomes too sharp, it is softened. When responsibility becomes too heavy, it is lightened. When silence becomes too loud, it is blurred. Not out of decadence alone, not out of moral collapse, but because relief is persuasive, and relief, when paired with power, reshapes systems. Ministers rise because rulers sleep longer. Bureaucracies strengthen because decisions are delayed. Trade routes matter because supply must be secured. Ceremonies expand because charisma must be maintained. Empires adjust around a cup placed quietly on a table. And here is the final irony. History remembers wars, borders, architectural triumphs, dynasties. It rarely remembers the measured grains of powder dissolved into honey. It rarely remembers the subtle shift in tone during a council held after wine. It rarely remembers that some of the grandest decisions may have been made by rulers simply trying to endure their own humanity. So perhaps the story was never about loving being high. Perhaps it was about loving relief, loving silence, loving warmth, loving imagination, loving one evening without the weight of a crown pressing into the skull. And if we are honest, that impulse is not medieval. It is timeless. The difference is scale. A common person softens the day and changes little beyond themselves. A ruler softens the day, and the structure of a kingdom shifts with them. One cup, one evening, one habit, and the machinery of history adjusts quietly around it. So, the next time you imagine a medieval throne room, imagine not only armor and banners and decrees. Imagine, somewhere just out of view, a small cup placed carefully, as if it were temporary and rarely questioned again.